Welcome to today's Career Month webinar program. My name is Adam Sylvain, and I work with the Alumni Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Real-World Advice from Segment Switchers. During this panel event, we will hear from 3 UChicago alumni, David Klein, Aaron Kelsey, and Bill Bila. David works as a Community Development Relationship Manager for Fifth Third Bank. His career has followed a path of passion for developing equitable communities for young people in Chicago, working with several nonprofits and more recently within community development for financial institutions. When not visiting schools and nonprofits around Chicago, he can be found at home in Chicago's Andersonville neighborhood with his husband and their dog. Aaron Kelsey is a financial advisor at Pekin Hardy Strauss Wealth Management, a Chicago-based investment advisory firm and certified B Corporation. Kelsey started her career in the nonprofit sector, working as an institutional fundraiser, first at Court Theater on the University of Chicago campus, and then at the Trust for Public Land before transitioning into wealth management. She holds a BA in English Language and Literature and an MBA from the University of Chicago. And Bill Bila is a leading advocate for Roma rights in Europe and internationally. He has served as the Vice President for the Roma Community Center in Toronto and has served on the boards of Roma Education Support Trust in the UK, Roma Education Fund in Switzerland, Slovakia, and Romania, and as part of La Voix des Roms in France. He is also President of the University of Chicago Alumni Association of France. Bill has more than 20 years of strategic planning and project management experience, coordinating with stakeholders in large multinational corporations, consulting firms, and non-governmental and governmental organizations across Europe and North America. So without further ado, I'm excited to kick off our discussion. And let's begin with David. Can you briefly share a bit about your current role and where you worked previously?
Yeah, so as my introduction said, or my bio said, that I work as a community development relationship manager for Fifth Third Bank, which is actually relatively recent. Just before that, I was with the Community Development Corporation of MB Financial, which recently was acquired by Fifth Third Bank. And before that, I was working with a nonprofit organization called the Emoja Student Development Corporation here in Chicago. And then really specifically what I do now is I work on an education initiative through the Community and Economic Development Department in the bank that is a philanthropic multi-partner initiative that is with the aim of working with neighborhood high schools in Chicago and helping young people leave high school and reach a living wage by their mid-20s. And so, and also connecting on financial empowerment tools with those young people. And working really closely with different nonprofit agencies that are receiving funding through our initiative. And so my work has followed a trajectory of working with education and with young people, but that currently I do that from the community development side from the bank.
Awesome, thanks. Bill, could you share a bit about your work and career path up to this point?
Yeah, after getting my bachelor's degree at NYU, I ended up working for Ernst & Young, worked in audit, then in consulting, and I moved to Prague in the Czech Republic. While I was working there, I decided, after a couple of years, what's the next step? And I didn't want to leave the country. I thought it was an interesting place to be at the time in the 90s, and find another job in consulting. I stayed there before getting my MBA in Chicago. After that, I worked for a large insurance company for several years, and again, with a few short stints in consulting in the meantime. And in 2014, I made the transition to becoming a freelance worker in the human rights and in the NGO space.
Great, thank you, Bill. Aaron, could you share a bit about your current work and professional path as well?
Sure. So currently, as I said in my bio, I work for a local to Chicago wealth management firm. We are a certified B Corporation, and we have a focus on socially responsible investing for our client base. We're small, so I wear a lot of different hats. I do wealth management for our clients, but I also do marketing, kind of whatever's needed because we're a small shop. Before I took this job, I've been here for actually about 18 months. So it was a relatively recent career transition. I spent a long time in the nonprofit sector. I actually started out of college working at Court Theater, which hopefully everyone is familiar with because it's the theater on the University of Chicago campus. So I was there for a while, and then I was at the Trust for Public Land in a variety of fundraising roles, mostly institutional giving and grant writing. And then about 18 months ago, I made the transition out of the nonprofit into kind of.
Oh, sorry, just cut out at the end there, Aaron. Your audio. We'll move to our next question, and Aaron, feel free. We can come back to that question later on if needed. So our next question, and Bill, maybe I'll invite you to respond first to this one. What made you decide it was time to make the switch in your career?
Yeah, I didn't want to say too much. It's perfect timing for me to answer that. Basically, in 2014, what happened was there's a lot of things happening in Europe, and I was doing a lot of volunteer work over the years, quite intensively since 2008 when I was in Toronto, and then I moved to France in 2010. And my volunteer work became more important to me than my actual job. The reason I got up in the morning, and it was just I enjoyed it much more. And in 2014, there were two things that were happening. One, the political situation in Europe, and a lot of, let's say, increase in the number of violent incidents against Roma. A lot of issues with politicians and hate speech. At the same time, there was a downsizing that was taking place. So I took the opportunity. Instead of trying to find another corporate job, I took the payout, was given a check, and in the downsizing, and decided to make the transition to work in basically human rights, Roma rights, arts and culture, whatever related to Roma. And this is primarily as a result of my volunteer work. And yeah, I did some fundraising projects, and I also did some online communications projects. So managing a web page or managing a Facebook page remotely for a small project based in Berlin, even though I was living in Paris.
Great. Thank you, Bill. David, can you share a bit about what brought you into your current role from that nonprofit experience that you were working previously?
Yeah. So I was not actively job searching at the time that the opportunity arose. I laugh because I started working for the bank about 2 years ago, which was 2 weeks before my wedding, which was not an ideal time to be job switching. But that what had happened is I had been working for one of the nonprofits that was being funded through this bank education initiative, and that through conversations with the lead philanthropic staff person from the bank, she approached me about taking this position. And so to some extent, I think I got a little bit lucky as in a right place, right time situation, but that it was also a really, it was a really tough decision to make, both personally about where I was in the universe at the time, but also professionally of thinking about, was this the right role for me in making a change? I was on a growth trajectory at my nonprofit at the time, and that this to some extent felt a little bit like starting over. But so that decision process was really tough for me. But that really thinking about what opportunities moving into the corporate world had, especially around doing social change work or nonprofit type functions through a corporation, allowed me to really think about where could I think about what type of impact I could have on an industry I was passionate about through my nonprofit work, but through a new lens of better understanding the philanthropic and corporate social responsibility tie-ins to the work I wanted to influence. So it was a lot of different things all at once, but really doing a lot of reflection and thinking about how I could change the type of impact I was making, or even make a bigger impact through my work by changing industries.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Aaron, I think we just the tail end of what you had shared for the last question cut out. So if you want to kind of wrap up what you were trying to share there, and then kind of segue into yeah, just your decision-making process and what led you from where you were previously into the new role.
Well, how far did I get? Because I realized I had dropped off, but I don't know where.
You were pretty much at the end. I think, yeah, maybe it was just the last, sentence or two, wrapping up your thoughts, I think.
Good. I'm glad that at least worked out. Yeah, so I guess, as I said before, I worked in the nonprofit sector as a fundraiser for a long time, and then about 18 months ago, transitioned into my current role at a wealth management firm. So, fairly significant shift. I decided to make the change while I was actually in business school. I was at Booth doing a part-time MBA. I originally envisioned that I was going to get that MBA and stay in the nonprofit sector, but just switch from fundraising to some other kind of role in nonprofits. And the more people I talked to and kind of talks I went to, the kind of, as David was saying, I started thinking about other ways to make impact, because it's not, you can make an impact outside of the nonprofit sector, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. So I decided that, if there was ever going to be a time I was going to make a big shift, it was coming out of the MBA program. If I ever wanted to make that jump, this was the moment. And I looked around for, sort of socially responsible or socially focused for-profit sector type jobs, but also ones that would translate well with my nonprofit experience into the for-profit. And I kind of landed on sort of the wealth management, socially responsible investing space as kind of the right combination of those two things.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. So our next question, why did you, and let's start with you, Aaron, on this question. Why did you originally join your first industry?
So I took my first job out of college at Court Theater because I loved the arts a lot. I still do. Makes it sound like it ended. I was really passionate about working in theater. I loved Court. I had interned there as a student, and it kind of was this perfect way to work in theater professionally and also have time. I was in shows in the evenings and kind of did the double work and half work outside of work life. So it really, for me, it was kind of a passion project, and that was where I thought I really wanted to be forever. Obviously, I changed my mind along the way, but it was really that, that love of theater itself that drove me into my first job.
Thanks. Bill, can you share what brought you into your first role?
Yeah, my first few jobs, basically, I was a business student. I went to school to make money. I wanted to work in the corporate sector. I wanted to be a responsible business person, save up enough money for retirement, have a big house, all of these kinds of things. And after many years of doing this, or let's say after several years of doing this, then getting my MBA, my career was really taking off, and then it just kind of went flat, and I wasn't really interested in what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. I really didn't like all the people that I was around on a day-to-day basis, and the stuff that I was doing in my volunteer world was what really mattered to me, and I wanted to see if I could do that for a living. And even if it's a lot less money, if I can at least make a living doing it, I want to try to do that. And it was very important to me. It was the timing of the issues and the issues that I was involved with. I feel very strongly about the equal rights, the Roma rights movement, and basically working in this field on a volunteer basis. I got to know a lot of people, and that's how I made the transition later. Yeah.
Thanks. David, what can you share about your kind of first roles in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, so I've been driven and passionate about educational spaces and youth development spaces for a long time, going back to my time at U of C, I was both a summer linker and a human rights intern on 2 consecutive summers. So those are 2 internship programs through the university that really gave me that experience of working in both youth development, but also with nonprofits in community development, which then transitioned to my first job out of college, where I was working for the Center on Halsted, an LGBT community center here in Chicago, running youth leadership programming and also a community networking program. I've never really mastered how to explain what that first job was, but that really from the day I left college, I've been involved in building connections between nonprofits for the sake of helping young people. And so my career has just kind of continued to grow in that, but that drive and passion I have is really where, what drew me to that industry in the first place.
Awesome, thanks, David. Our next question, and let's stick with you on this one as well, David. How would you say you get a foot in the door when your network is in one industry? I think that's a common question and potential obstacle for folks looking to make a whether a minor or a more dramatic switch in industries.
Yeah, when I was looking over the questions, this is the one I think I wasn't sure how much I have to offer to it, because I really, like I said, I wasn't actively searching for my job when I switched industries. And I do think that what helped me a little bit along the way is taking advantage of different kinds of professional learning communities. And so showing up in trainings and discussions about the education sector in Chicago that bring together both business leaders, philanthropic leaders, and nonprofit leaders was a good way to meet people and just grow my network that way. And so I think one of the best pieces of advice I have is just like showing up in spaces where you'll actually bump into people from different industries.
Awesome, thanks, David. Bill, can you share a bit about your experience, navigating that networking in different industries, and particularly in the case of where your network might be pretty centralized in one industry?
I definitely agree with what David said. It's a lot of it is showing up at different events and just meeting people. It's building that network. For me, when I was downsized out of my role and I got a nice severance check, I had a little bit of time to look around, and I looked at a variety of different jobs in nonprofit, and it was very difficult to get my foot in the door anywhere where I didn't have a personal network. I applied for a lot of different jobs, and for jobs that were less than half of my current, or at the time, my current salary. The only place where I was successful in gaining some projects and eventually some part-time work was through the personal connections that I built. So it was all of the volunteer work, all the board memberships where I was a volunteer board member, that led me to meet people at different events, different conferences, through my presence on social media, that I got noticed and people came to me, and when I was looking for work, or that I could tell them that I'm looking for work, that's how the work came to me. And it was through this different volunteer work and all of the people that I met through it that allowed me to get basically some paid work in addition to the volunteer work that I was doing in the same area. Applying to different jobs in the nonprofit sector in Paris was very difficult for me. Just as a complete outsider, I lived in basically 6 or 7 different places. So I lived in Prague, I lived in Munich, I lived in Toronto, Richmond, Virginia, and of course Chicago and New York. So my network is around the world, but it's not very dense in any specific location. And it's not very dense in any specific industry. So this made it very difficult for me to basically target a specific area that I wanted to do, other than the stuff that I was already passionate about and the stuff that I was already involved in, and that was the Roma work, Roma arts and culture, Roma arts rights movement, and the history, and that's where my money came from eventually when I started working.
Thank you, Bill. Aaron, are you with us over audio? I know we had some issues with the video feed.
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic.
Can you share a bit about how you leveraged a network both within and outside of your industry, or what sort of limitations or obstacles you had to to networking when you were making this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to second what David said about just kind of, showing up in, finding those spaces where you're going to encounter people who are, interested in the same things and are, in that industry already. It's hard to find those spaces, but, putting in the time and figuring out where they are and kind of showing up and being there, especially if you're transitioning for-profit to nonprofit, volunteering and board service are great ways to kind of start to build that network. The other thing that was really helpful for me when I was making my transition was, reaching out to actually the UChicago Alumni Network, because they are everywhere. And even if you don't know alums, at a personal level, maybe I was really lucky, but people were very responsive even to just cold emails from me when I was thinking about what that transition looked like. And I could just say, hey, I'm a University of Chicago alum. I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z. Can I buy you a coffee or, get 15 minutes on the phone with you? And people were really responsive to it. So, even if you don't feel like you have the network in the industry you're looking for, you may have a UChicago network that is still going to be willing to chat with you and give you advice. So don't fully discount sort of those cold emails to strangers, though I know they can be maybe stressful or feel like they're less productive. But the UChicago network was really, really helpful for me making that transition.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. We're getting some really great questions from our audience. So I want to encourage folks who are joining us to continue to submit those questions. We'll have a time very shortly to get to some of those. But before that, we did have a couple more. This one, and maybe Erin, you can jump on this next question as well. What advice would you have? And I think, well, you kind of shared some of this already, but if you have any other ideas apart from the cold outreach to other alumni and kind of building relationships that way. Any other advice or anything else that you found useful in terms of building a new network, particularly in an industry where maybe you don't have one already?
I mean, the time-consuming and expensive option is going to grad school. Unfortunately, going to grad school is a great way to build that network and meet new people, both inside and outside of your industry, especially if you're thinking about a big career change, depending on the program, that can be really helpful. I know that is not practical advice for a lot of people. I certainly understand that, but that is part of what you should think about if you're considering grad school, is sort of who's going to be there with you and what kind of network are you going to get out of that experience. And even if you don't go to grad school, I mean, as I said before, reach out to those UChicago alums. They are very helpful and very warm, and I definitely recommend it.
Thanks. Bill, any more that you can share? I know you mentioned, showing up in these spaces, maybe where you're volunteering or where your passion lies is powerful. Any other advice that you'd give in terms of building that network?
Other than repeating what you've just heard, I mean, use the alumni network. For me, the University of Chicago Alumni Network was also useful in the nonprofit sector, although more for chatting and finding out stuff about the industry, finding out how to prepare for an interview with alumni who were based in the US, because there weren't that many. I was looking in Europe, and so it's not that many University of Chicago alumni in Europe that are necessarily working in nonprofit, but I'm actually making the transition back into business. I've been doing nonprofit for the last 4.5, 5 years. I'm going back into the business world for financial reasons, and that's me. I'm leading up to the next question eventually, but the point there being that building the network, for me, it was mostly through the volunteer activities, but the University of Chicago Alumni Network has been very useful as well, and always responsive.
Thank you, Bill. David, anything to add to what's been shared already in terms of building a network?
The biggest thing I'll add is it wasn't a secret to the people who hired me that I was a segment switcher. And so really working closely with my colleagues and managers to help me know who I should be knowing in the industry I've transitioned into. And so being an active and engaged learner with my managers about how I transitioned to a new segment was really important for how I got to meet new people and better understand the sector I was now a part of.
Great, thanks so much, David. And I think, as Bill mentioned, we'll segue into our next question here, which is a lot of job seekers are interested in making the switch to the nonprofit sector, or a lot of seekers who are interested in making that switch anticipate being faced with challenges. Which perceived or actual challenges did you experience while making that transition to a nonprofit career, and how did you overcome them? Maybe a lot to unpack in that question, but anything that you can address there, David?
Well, I actually was thinking about the challenges of moving into a for-profit career for me, and this probably actually applies in both directions. But one of my biggest things I was reflecting on is the not having a baseline knowledge of the industry I've moved into. That community development within financial institutions is to some degree a niche job, and that because I was recruited to work specifically on this education program, I was on a niche initiative in a niche part of the bank, and I didn't come from a banking background, and I think just that overall knowledge of the industry that I'm a part of and where my skills are valuable and are a value add to those financial institution pieces, but that just really thinking about all the things I didn't know about the industry I was moving into were some of those really big challenges, and just really having to be engaged learner in that whole process and being aware of what I didn't know and seeking out advice and guidance for how I could figure some of that stuff out.
Thanks, David. And Bill, as someone who made the transition from for-profit to nonprofit, would you kind of share David's assessment that kind of works both ways, or what were the challenges that you faced in making that transition?
I agree with everything that David said. Well, what I could add to that is you have to know the industry, be able to demonstrate you know the industry, but you also have to have a thick skin, and you have to talk to a lot of people because you have to get through all the people who have this basically prejudice against you. I talk to a lot of people in nonprofit. They just their experience is such that people who come from the for-profit industry are too abrasive, are not people-oriented enough, don't know how to. It's a different kind of, let's say, culture and environment, and they're not willing to take the risk. So you need to talk to people who are willing to embrace someone who's from a different background, and don't be discouraged when you get a lot of people who will dismiss you because you're from the for-profit industry. I've had that happened, and while some people really appreciate the fact that you can bring something from a corporation, from, let's say, your understanding of business to a nonprofit organization in terms of efficiency, controlling, human resources management, a lot of people don't appreciate that, and they're afraid that you might change things too much. So you just have to be careful about the balance of how you project and communicate that to, and be aware that there are some people that you can't convince, and you need to keep looking and talk to the right person. You need to talk to a lot of people before you find the right person. If there's any way you can figure out how to get to the right person first and avoid all those unnecessary conversations, I'd like to know how to do that too. But if that's what you can do, and you just have to be ready to face a lot of rejection as well.
Thanks, Bill. Aaron, anything you can share about real or perceived challenges that you faced in making your transition?
I would second and third a lot of what David and Bill have already said. I think going both directions, there's a perception of what for-profit is if you work in the nonprofit sector, and there's a perception of what nonprofit is if you work in the for-profit sector. And that right there is a challenge. Certainly when I was starting to apply to jobs in the for-profit sector, I got some funny looks and people who didn't understand what I had done before, even though, I felt like I'd been working very hard. It didn't read necessarily, or they assumed that nonprofit was like fluffier work somehow, which we know is not true at all. I think part of what kind of helps with that is, learning about the industry, but also you need to know the language of the industry you're moving into. That was huge for me, going fundraising into finance was just being able to speak the language of finance competently enough in an interview was, it was a challenge for me, but it was really, really important to be able to speak to them and speak about my experience in the nonprofit sector in terms that they understood. So, learning that language and becoming, as fluent as you can in the industry you're looking to move into will help. You'll sound more like you belong there and like you know what you're talking about.
Great, thanks. So I want to move into Q&A here very shortly, but let's kind of make that transition by first asking, and Aaron, if you can respond first here. What advice do you have for marketing yourself and conveying how your skills, from for-profit into non-profit or vice versa, how those skills are transferable and how they can be applied from one industry to another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess a little bit, part of it is exactly what I was just talking about, is sort of learning that language and knowing how to, phrase things on your resume and how to talk about things in an interview. That is really, really important. What I found was helpful for me was, getting outside opinions, talking to people I trusted about, if does this make sense to you? Talking to people in the industry I was looking to move into to sort of, describe my experience and make sure that it read to them as, related experience. I was lucky to have a really helpful career advisor at Booth who did a really great job. Just, she had such a better understanding of what the for-profit sector was looking for, of kind of being able to break down my resume and say, okay, this is how you're talking about it on your resume. Let's change these words and make it sort of translate into this new sector. So getting outside perspectives, I think, is really helpful. And, checking yourself with people you trust who are in the industry, or even if it's not, if you're going for-profit to nonprofit, and maybe your friend's not in the nonprofit sector, but someone who's not in your industry, have them read your resume, talk to them about your job, and make sure you can communicate what you do clearly in a way that someone outside of it will understand, because that, you need to be able to talk about your experience in a way that the nonprofit hiring director is going to understand. And if you have like a really technical finance background, that's going to be a challenge. So, ask your friends, get some help, but make sure you know how to talk about yourself.
Thanks, Aaron. Bill, anything you can share around, marketing your skills across industries?
Yeah, part of what Aaron was saying, that learning the language or the culture of the environment in which you're getting yourself into. Of course, you always, in a job interview, you have to project confidence, and you have to say that you can get the job done, and you explain how your skills translate into the new job. However, I would suggest that you be a little bit careful if you're moving from the business world to the nonprofit world about projecting too much confidence or being speaking in such a way that it's like, I'm absolutely certain that what I know I can apply in your world. There's a little bit more subtlety, a little bit more open-ended or questioning. You explain what you've done and you explain how you think it might apply, but don't be overly convincing, saying that it absolutely is like that, like you're on an advertising campaign. Show a little bit more of a human face and a little bit of ability to doubt and to question while projecting confidence, I think is part of that, or at least that was my experience here in France. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. David, anything you can add to what Bill and Aaron have shared in marketing your skills across sectors?
There's something I want to echo from what Aaron was saying, is that the perception of fluffiness, I guess, around nonprofit work can be really infuriating when you really cut your teeth in that industry, because a lot of, especially smaller community-based organizations, really push you to wear 100 hats at the same time, and that there's an adaptability and a tenacity that kind of comes with that. And so in really explaining how you fit into a corporate culture that is a lot more compartmentalized and is definitely way more resourced than a lot of nonprofits, where you realize that there's people whose only job is something that would have been one of 10 jobs for someone in a nonprofit, right? And so really helping people see that those concrete skills that you bring with you, even in those, even in a more resourced environment, is really important. And so I think a lot about like the things that I use on a day-to-day basis in my current role working for a financial institution are things that I learned entirely in my nonprofit institution work. Things like all the relationship management, working with a variety of stakeholders and understanding their self-interest in a project or an outcome, thinking about things like data and analysis is one of those things that often is thrown onto everyone in a nonprofit organization, and being able to bring my experience of that to what I do in my day-to-day role, all of those things really come up a lot. And so really demonstrating what I learned wearing so many hats in a corporate environment has really helped me make that transition.
Thanks, David. So at this time, I would like to have us transition to Q&A, and I just want to let folks know we have a lot of questions in our queue. If we're not able to get to your specific question, I will certainly do my best to connect you offline, with the person who you're hoping to get these answers from. So we'll tackle as many of these as we can in our remaining time here. The first question, and I am going to kind of prioritize the questions that are more open to the group here. And again, if you have a specific question for one of our panelists, I'll try and connect you more offline. So our first question, how would you think age affects the career transition process? And are there relative advantages to transitioning early in career versus late in career? And I'll invite any one of you to kind of jump on that question first to share any thoughts you might have about, how to answer that.
I think, if I'll jump in, I think a lot of what David said just in the last part of his answer relates to this. It's not so much about age, it's about being able to demonstrate what you know how to do, whether it's the relationship management or if you had multiple responsibilities in your previous position and you're able to convey that in the new position, whether you're coming from nonprofit or from the corporate world, where if you can explain that you had all of these 10 different responsibilities, and that you can adapt, that you didn't have a secretary to do everything for you, but you actually had to do all of these things yourself. I think that's much more important than your actual age and your level of experience. I think if you're looking at salary and you're moving into nonprofit, I think if you're looking at something that is less than like a director level position, it would be difficult without more experience to think that you can move from business into a high level position in nonprofit very easily just because you came from a business environment. I think you need the years of experience before you can move and come into a management position. Just because the salaries are lower doesn't mean that there is an expectation for a lower level of skills.
Thanks.
My contribution about the age question is that to what I was saying before about working with colleagues and understanding what I know or don't know, I think that I'm sure age was a factor, and that was in my late 20s when I made that transition, and that I think there's an understanding of someone who's a little bit younger working with someone who's a little bit older, and my manager being a bit older than me, really trying to guide me through that. And I think age did play a role in me being allowed to not know things or being inquisitive or trying to figure out a new industry in a way that I'm curious if I was older, if that wouldn't have been as accepted or easily translated.
Great, thanks, David and Bill. Move on to our next question, and I think this was alluded to in a few of the responses about kind of educating yourself on the culture and the language of the industry that you're moving into. But we have a question regarding experiencing imposter syndrome in your new industry, if that was an experience that any of the three of you had, and if so, how you overcame it, perhaps with some of the preparation that you outlined, but anything else that you can speak to in your experience of imposter syndrome. Maybe we can start with Aaron, because I know, Aaron, you mentioned the need really to educate yourself on, everything that's different about the sector that you're switching into. Anything you can share about how you were successful in that?
Sure. I guess for me, I was really clear during the interview process moving into this job, or I tried to be really clear about what I knew and what I was going to need to learn. So when I came in, I had tried to be clear about that, and then, the people who hired me also knew where I was coming from. So there was an enormous learning curve. Like I don't want to make that sound like it was easy, because there was a ton to learn when I got here. But I think coming in and looking at it as a learning opportunity and being, upfront with my supervisor about, what I was going to be capable of to begin with and where I was going to need help, you know, I guess it felt overwhelming at times, but it didn't feel as much. I didn't feel like I was suffering from imposter syndrome as much, because I felt like, because I was able to have those kind of frank conversations along the way, I didn't feel so much like I didn't belong. It was just, I was working towards belonging, but I wasn't made to feel like, I'd gotten something I wasn't prepared for. So I think, be honest with people when you interview, and be honest with yourself when you're interviewing. And we've talked about this a little bit of, knowing what you don't know. If you're honest about all of that, and you kind of look at it as a learning opportunity, for me, that was really helpful in feeling like I had earned my place here even early on, even when I was struggling, because I kind of had laid that foundation in the interview process and then with my supervisor here.
Great, thank you. Bill and David, anything to add to what Aaron shared on that question?
I would add, just from a different angle, don't be discouraged. You may have interviews, you may run across people who won't necessarily be interviewing and looking for competencies, but they'll be looking for years of experience. And just because you haven't done the exact same job before doesn't mean that you can't do it, but they might not want to hire you because they don't want to take the risk. And this is probably more of an issue in Europe than in America. But really, people look to check the boxes and see what you've actually done, as opposed to what you can do. And you might not want to end up working in that kind of environment anyway, but you will run across those people, and just be aware that that's a possibility.
Great, thanks, Bill.
One of the places where I think I've been challenged to really think about where I belong is actually more on a social aspect, is moving from a 40-person community-based nonprofit that was a lot of educators, social workers, people who'd been in that field a lot, to being in a very corporate environment with people who were lifelong bankers. Even in the community work, everyone came from a banking background. And I think there was a social stuff that came up about, what am I doing here? And have I made the right choice of moving from more socially minded people to people who don't always consider that at the forefront of their career? And so that was one of the places where I was like, oh God, have I made all of the wrong decisions my entire career up until this point? And I think that was something it took me a while to get more comfortable with. And it's still something where I feel confronted on sometimes today, of reminding myself that even though I come from a completely different background professionally, that I do have a lot to contribute to the spaces that I'm in. And that social or the non-work part of being at work stuff comes up with that a lot for me.
Great, thank you. Bill, I'll start with you with this next question. So we have a question regarding ways to get a sense of a new job or industry before deciding to make the leap. I know that you shared that much of your career path has been influenced by volunteer work that you did initially, so maybe you'd start there in advice. But the person is asking, are there internships appropriate for someone mid-career, for example, or do corporations have opportunities to volunteer, and maybe how do you pursue those opportunities in a meaningful way?
I don't know of any internships, and someone who's mid-career or someone who's been working for 10 years, I'm not aware of any that someone could, maybe they exist in the US, but in Europe specifically, that's highly discouraged. Once you're in the workforce, you don't want to restart everything all over from the beginning as if you're an entry-level person. You need to come in and show that you have the skills, and you do. So don't start all over again. Um, but really, what was important for me was the network. I was volunteering on boards of different organizations, and it was thanks to those connections that I'd met other people that I could get connections to paid work. If it wasn't for that, I would never be able to take on that work. So get involved outside of your work today. Get involved in something that you enjoy doing and see how it develops. And eventually you can make a plan around that. But first thing is to show up, decide what you really like, show up, and then talk to people. And once you talk to people, you can figure out and make a plan of what is that transition? Where is there a potential career? Where can I find those opportunities? You'll learn more from talking to people than through any kind of specific organized plan or internship program that exists, in my opinion.
Thanks, Bill. Anything to add, David or Aaron, regarding how to pursue opportunities, perhaps not through a mid-career internship, but maybe volunteer work or other ways that might give you a necessary exposure to an industry or opportunity you'd be interested in?
I think Bill summed it up really well.
Perfect. All right, we'll move on. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions here. We actually have an attendee, Bill, who was hoping maybe you could expound a little bit more on your transition that you're under, so your transition back to the for-profit world, and kind of what has motivated that decision, and kind of how you're undertaking that this most recent trip.
Yeah, good question. Basically, when I left the business world and went into nonprofit, I did this because of the timing of this basically downsizing that took place. So I had a severance check. I received unemployment for a while. I used my network to find paid work, and it was on a freelance basis. And for about 2.5, 3 years, I had some good paying projects, but they were at a level that was about half or slightly under half of what my salary was. I was targeting maybe 60% of what I could make. And I was hoping that after I get some experience and I make a little bit more network connections, that I could eventually expand and raise a little bit higher the financial part of what I'm doing and continue the work that I enjoy doing. After 2 years, I saw that the work that I want to and that I can do is very specialized and very limited. I didn't see very many more opportunities, and the projects that I was working on started to come to an end. There were not more projects in the field that I was working in, and I decided it's time to cut my losses, go back into the business world, because I can't make a living doing this. I'm based in Paris. It's a high cost of living city, and I need to make a salary again. And what's happening with this transition is through Alumni and basically going back to the corporate world that I was in before, it's also talking to the right people. I've met quite a few people who really support the idea that I went out, I did what I wanted to do. I was passionate about the work that I did, and I gained new experiences at levels of higher levels in the organization, like governance issues and top management issues that I wouldn't have necessarily gotten working for a large corporation at a much lower level. So having that variety of the experience is very much welcomed. At the same time, it depends who you talk to, because some people might not appreciate that as much. So it's getting to the right people to move back. So for me, it's purely a financial issue. I couldn't make it, and I didn't fully research that as well as I could have, or I wasn't aware of basically I need more money, and I can't make it in the nonprofit world.
Thank you, Bill. So perhaps our last question, and this one's more open to the group, but I'll maybe start with Aaron here because I think it also alludes to what we had talked about in terms of educating yourself. Perhaps that's through a master's program, but we know that's not an option for everyone. We have an attendee who's asking, what can you share in terms of advice on building up the necessary skill set to enter an industry? Whether for candidates at all levels, but here for senior candidates where maybe, having a defined skill set in this new industry is important. Any advice on achieving that besides more education in a master's?
I mean, if you can do it, the master's degree is definitely helpful depending on where you're trying to go. I think what you are doing, if you're going for-profit to nonprofit, like there are commonalities between what you're going to do in both of those types of jobs, I would think. So, don't discount the experience that you have. It's part of it is just kind of figuring out how to talk about the experience you have, talk about the jobs you've had, and talk about it in a way that's kind of appealing for the sector you're going into. If you're switching into nonprofit, you can learn a lot about nonprofits and sort of build useful skills by serving on a board. I would say more than volunteering at a nonprofit. If you are on a nonprofit board, you can actually learn a lot if you're on an active board about how an organization works. And just kind of, if you're going for profit to nonprofit, understanding how a nonprofit functions is going to be so helpful for you as you have conversations with in interviews and things like that. So if that's the transition you're thinking about making, don't discount it. Maybe it doesn't look like sort of a hard skills building opportunity, but don't discount the opportunity to work with a board or serve on a board, because you can get a lot of value out of that, and you can understand the industry a lot better if you come in and sort of want to understand and make those opportunities to be involved. So I really recommend that if that's the switch you're thinking about.
Great. David or Bill, anything to add in response to that question? Could maybe have time for one more otherwise. All right, great. Well, this is a question that's come up in a theme of a few questions here, and I think something that was touched on earlier, maybe most relevant for folks transitioning from for-profit to nonprofit, but I imagine it maybe happens the other way as well. But if you have an advanced degree, many employers may consider you overqualified. How do you, and I think that sometimes bears itself in, with concerns about salary and things like that. Is that something that you encountered, and how would you recommend overcoming that issue as you make this transition? David, maybe you can start us off on that.
One of the things that I was reflecting on before today's webinar, and I think this is kind of like a parallel answer to your question, is the role that I ended up taking when I moved from nonprofit to for-profit in terms of the actual role function was something of a lateral, or even in terms of responsibility, maybe even a step backwards on my career trajectory, which was a really tough thing for me to really grapple with, and was really central to where I struggled on whether or not to make the move that I ended up making. And to that sense of being overqualified, that I went from more of a program management type role to more of a on the ground type role, which was really, that was the biggest change I made. But that what really got me through that, and I think might answer the original question, is really thinking about how I push myself to take the longer view on the types of opportunities that the overall segment switch would allow me to do. I think as the conversation about things like joining a board has come up, I'm actually in the process of interviewing for an associate's board for a nonprofit here in Chicago, which is something I probably could not have ever done when I was working in nonprofit, right? So that bigger question of how do I increase the kind of impact I want to make in a lot of different ways, both in my job function, in what I'm learning in the corporate environment, but also where I'm allowed to think about my personal giving and volunteer work in a completely new way. That bigger picture that I was unable to unpack, even though my original role change wasn't exactly 100% what I wanted to be changing to doing. I think it allowed me to really grow in a new role with a corporation and take a whole new direction in my both my career, but also in some aspects of my personal life as well.
Awesome, thanks, David. And yeah, being mindful of the time, we'll wrap up here in just a moment. But I'm glad you brought up board service, because we do actually have a webinar panel later this month during Career Month that explores that topic of joining a nonprofit board. So certainly relevant for, I'm sure, many of our attendees today. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank in a special way our three panelists, David, Aaron, and Bill, for sharing their experiences with segment switching. Our Career Month programming continues tomorrow, Thursday, November 7th, with a webinar titled How to Create and Grow Your Personal Brand. I hope you can join us for that event and many more throughout November. You can visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for a list of our most upcoming programs. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, David, Bill, and Aaron.
Thank you.